In a games industry full of disappointment and mediocrity, From Software stands out as one of the last pillars of excellence. Like many others, I looked forward to Elden Ring's expansion more than any other new game release, because I knew that FromSoft couldn't let me down. And unfortunately, I was wrong. It gravely hurts me to admit this, but Shadow of the Erdtree is by far the worst Miyazaki-led Souls-like title to date. It takes every flaw present in Elden Ring's exploration and boss design and makes them several times worse. I'm certain that a lot of the negative discourse surrounding Elden Ring's expansion will be centered around the overly difficult bosses, and while I agree that the bosses are overtuned and not fun to learn, I also think the difficulty discussion is overshadowing the DLC's biggest flaw. Immediately when I started playing Shadow of the Erdtree, I could feel that something was not right, and I think a lot of people aren't admitting it, but they could feel it too. On my first playthrough of Elden Ring, I was immediately hooked, yet now in the DLC, I could not contain my boredom. Much to my dismay, I realized that the worst part of the DLC is not the bosses, it's the exploration. There are two types of rewards for exploration: intrinsic rewards that are inherently enjoyable, like a beautiful view or a fun boss, and extrinsic rewards like increasing character stats. Shadow of the Erdtree has inconsistent intrinsic rewards and downright terrible extrinsic rewards. The majority of intrinsic rewards in Elden Ring's base game were underwhelming, and then a small amount were truly great. Typically, after riding your horse past a ton of reskinned enemies for 6 to 8 minutes, you might find a linear cave with mostly one enemy type and a reskinned boss at the end. Also, many of the extrinsic rewards you would find in these dungeons would be useless for any one build, such as a melee fighter finding spells. The glue that held this uneven experience together was the universal extrinsic reward of runes to increase player stats. Even if a cave was boring and had a reskinned boss, at least I leveled up. Like many players, I started the DLC around level 150, meaning that I had already hit almost all of the caps on my stats and I would get highly diminished returns for increasing my levels. Furthermore, I had max healing, a fully upgraded weapon, and tons of upgrade materials, so all of those rewards had also become useless. FromSoft understood the problem of useless rewards, so they added two new items: Scadu Tree Fragments, which I believe are supposed to be called Shadow Tree Fragments, and Revered Spirit Ash. Shadow Tree Fragments increase all player stats in the DLC world only, while Revered Spirit Ash increases the strength of summons and your horse, meaning that Revered Spirit Ash is largely useless for someone like me who doesn't use summons. So now instead of every enemy and tons of upgrade items being important rewards for exploration, there's only one or two items in the entire game that are important, and for some inexplicable reason, they are not the rewards for completing dungeons. You get these items by wandering around the open world and finding statues. As Video Game Donkey said, it's Paper Mario Sticker Star all over again. Outside of Shadow Realm blessings, a few new talismans, and if you decide to build switch to a new weapon, all extrinsic rewards in the DLC are worthless. Now whenever I explore and see a purple item, I'm always thinking, please be the only important item in the game, and then I'm sorely disappointed when it's just another cookbook and I wasted my time. While playing the DLC, the same important question kept coming to my mind. Why is a game with mostly useless rewards open world? The whole point of the open world genre is exploring to find rewards. What point does the open world serve if I have no reason to explore the mediocre caves? Unfortunately, it gets worse, as the intrinsic rewards for exploration are also worse than in the base game. As I'll get into later, many of the Remembrance bosses feel less like rewards and more like punishments, and the mini-boss quality is terrible. Most cave or catacombs bosses are just buffed up normal enemies that don't pose much challenge, and when it's something else it's usually an NPC or a reskin Death Knight. The base game also had normal enemies as dungeon bosses, but that worked better since you were a low-level character fighting an endgame mob, as opposed to a high-level character fighting a normal enemy. They also added forges as a new mini-dungeon environment, which I do think looks cool. However, the big twist with the forge dungeons is that they don't even have a boss at the end. Similar to the base game, the mini dungeons are also lacking in enemy variety. Another reward for exploration are the mausoleums, which are always NPC invader duel fights instead of actual bosses. When Miyazaki said that Elden Ring DLC would be the size of Limgrave, I knew he was lying, but now I wish he was telling the truth, because somehow the terrible rewards for exploration are stretched even more thinly than in the base game. Although I could have missed some caves in my boredom, I didn't find any caves at all in the 3 ginormous southern regions of the map, one of those regions being the Abyss, where your horse is too scared to be rideable, so I explored the sea of reskinned rat enemies slowly on foot, only to find more cookbooks. I still can't believe that there are 3 giant regions in the south of the map that each have nothing of interest besides a single short legacy dungeon and remembrance boss. For a Fromsoft game, I was constantly taken aback by how absurdly lazy the DLC was. The entire game, I kept wondering what would be on top of that large green plateau to the northeast, only to finally discover 2 tree sentinels and a fallen star beast, reskinned overworld bosses from the last game. This game also brings back dragons, and for the love of God, why? Didn't we fight enough of the 15 million dragons in the base game? I suppose the dragon remembrance boss Bayle needed a few reskinned dragons before his fight, but there shouldn't be any dragons anywhere else. There's also a few putrid tree spirits in the Shadow Keep, another boss I didn't want to see again. It's jarring to me that this game took 2.5 years to develop, yet most dungeon bosses are NPCs and many overworld bosses are reskins from the last game. I guess all of the money went into the remembrance bosses and the Shadow Keep, but they still felt the need to make the game way too big, so we ended up with this bloated mess. Another time I was taken aback by the game's laziness was when I completed the Stone Coffin Fissure Legacy Dungeon and beat Putrescent Knight, only to be rewarded with a cookbook. They couldn't even have the decency to reward me with a single Shadow Tree fragment. The only intrinsic reward that was consistently good was the environmental art. Every time I discovered a new region of the map, I would be blown away by its immense beauty. The color theory and the lighting is some of the best I've ever seen in video games, almost like a Bob Ross painting come to life. Of course, when actually exploring most of it, all you find are reskinned enemies, NPC bosses, and empty space, but at least it looks really good. While playing the DLC, I'd constantly be overwhelmed by its ginormous size that rivals the base game. I'm certain that many will praise it for its size, but I do not see bigger as better. More so than in the base game, the DLC is quantity over quality to the max. Every time I stumbled upon a new beautiful vista, my only thought was, I have to ride my horse through every inch of this boredom to find underwhelming caves with unimportant rewards to eventually find a nugget of interesting content in the Legacy Dungeon. Intrinsically and extrinsically, open world exploration is far worse than in Elden Ring's base game, but what about the Legacy Dungeons? Could these levels give me the traditional Souls-like experience I so desire? There are 6-ish legacy dungeons in the DLC, although some are too tiny to really count. I'll cover the level design of these dungeons separate from the bosses, which I'll analyze later in the video. I'm also going to separate the legacy dungeons into 3 categories, those being small and underwhelming, small and fun, and large and fun. Starting with the largest category, small and underwhelming, we have the first legacy dungeon, Rat. The enemy variety here is almost cave levels of bad with the same 2 ghost enemies everywhere, and the interconnectivity is by no means amazing. The second legacy dungeon, Castle Ensis, is worse, to the point that I don't really consider it a legacy dungeon. It's more like a fort with a really difficult boss. Stone Coffin Fissure is the southern dungeon, and it's also pretty short and boring with the same rock turret enemies everywhere. Hey guys, while editing the video, I realized that the bigger issue with the small legacy dungeons is less that they have bad enemy variety, and more that they reuse too many enemies between each other and the open world, so they feel repetitive. I think I was a bit too negative in this quick analysis, which is because the small legacy dungeons weren't good enough to make up for the empty world surrounding them. Stepping it up into the small and fun dungeons, we have one of my favorites, Midra's Mainz. This manor has good enemy variety, illusory walls behind paintings, and some solid interconnected level design. I love it when you start from the floor and scale the level to the rafters and then have to do jank platforming while looking down where you once were. It's also really cool how you can hear a man screaming while you complete the dungeon, piquing your interest to go find out what's causing his pain. The game's final dungeon, near a limb, is also pretty small like the others, although I liked this one quite a lot. Level design wise, it's nowhere near as good as Midra's Mainz, and I think a lot of my enjoyment came from the fact that I like exploring a castle in the sky. There's only one legacy dungeon left to cover, and I saved the best for last, Shadow Keep, which is the only dungeon in the long and fun category, and this one is ginormous. It's like 2 or 3 legacy dungeons smashed into one. The best way to explain it is that it's like if you took High Wall of Lothric, the Grand Archives, and New Londo Ruins, and smashed them all into one level, then you'd get Shadow Keep. I particularly enjoyed traversing the Grand Archive section of the level, where you scale the inside and outside of a library tower in pursuit of the keep's lord. Another cool thing about Shadow Keep is that it connects to 7 different plateaus that surround it at different elevations, meaning that you'll enter the Shadow Keep, explore a little, find a coffin that leads to another plateau, then you'll explore that for 5+ hours before returning to the best level in the game, and this gameplay loop occurs several times. The only problem with this gameplay loop is that some of the plateaus, like the northeast and northwest green ones, are exceptionally boring with tons of free-skinned enemies, empty space, and no caves, but I digress. Shadow Keep is the best part of the DLC by far. It's so good that I wish the overworld was shrunk down to 1/4 of its size, and that the DLC was just the Shadow Keep connecting you to other legacy dungeons, and a few small overworld zones full of things to find, but that isn't what we got. Although it's good that there is a fantastic level in the DLC, I can't help but feel like it came at the cost of other legacy dungeons shrinking in size as they got less attention. This is a very big problem, as there are entire regions of the map that are almost completely empty outside of their legacy dungeon, and when those dungeons are super short, that means the only good reward for exploration isn't really worth the cost of riding torrent around every inch of the overworld's empty wasteland. So exploration is not very good, and the legacy dungeons are a mixed bag, which only leaves one thing left to talk about: the boss battles. And just like with exploration, a lot of people are pointing out that something just isn't right with these bosses. Something just isn't fun anymore. Some say the biggest problem is that the bosses never stop attacking, while others say their damage is overtuned, and I'm here to disagree with all of them, not because they aren't valid complaints, but because it isn't the biggest issue. In my In Defense of Elden Ring boss design video, I chose not to use healing items to prove that every boss is beatable in an aggressive playstyle without hit trading. However, this caused me to avoid the absolute worst part of Elden Ring boss design, which is the healing speed. When fought optimally, Elden Ring bosses have a very tight flow with tons of roll catches to punish imprecise play with high damage. Once you take 1 or 2 hits, you'll already be low enough to want to back out and heal, so you'll roll backwards into the boss's roll catch and die. But let's say you actually do get out and heal. The boss can either run directly into your face and do a melee combo to drain the health right away, or they can pelt you with magic combos, which in the case of Rellana can be a 5-part spell combo with roll catches that's harder to dodge at a distance to punish your healing. I'd find myself often having to spend 5 healing items just to get to full once. Now let's look at a good game like Sekiro. If I'm fighting that game's final boss Ishin, I can heal at mid-range, which prompts Ishin to attack, and I have time to deflect before the heal is over. In Sekiro and Bloodborne, the healing speed feels purposefully designed so that if you get far enough away, you'll have just enough time to heal and get back into the fight. While in Elden Ring, it feels purposefully designed that if I heal, there's always a chance the boss can hit me and I can't do anything about it. You can sometimes get away with waiting for a charged heavy opening to heal, but since the boss's posture bar is always lowering, I'd rather just take the charged heavy and only heal after posture break. The issue with healing isn't just a problem with some bosses, it's every Remembrance boss. I genuinely believe that if healing speed was increased to 1.5 to 2 times, a good amount of the difficulty complaints would resolve. This seems like an easy fix for Fromsoft to add, but they will never do it because they want you to die a bunch. In my last Elden Ring video, I pointed out that the game is terrible at communicating how to fight the bosses in a fun way. They don't show the posture bar, or indicate jumpable attacks, or teach the player positioning openings with a teaching boss. I thought this was because it was too hard to teach the player game mechanics in an open world where they can go anywhere, but after the DLC I realized that I was an overly optimistic idiot. The reason why these bosses don't communicate anything to the player is because they don't want the vast majority of players to learn how to fight the bosses in a fun way. Take an example like Bayle. He has an instant damage roar knockdown into lightning spam that he combos with melee attacks after. A challenge runner might notice the tiniest visual cue, like with how he slightly brings his head forward before doing the roar. But that cue is purposefully hidden because the developers don't want you to figure out how to dodge the damage. They want you to get hit and then spam roll the lightning and then die to a melee attack and complain to your friends about how once again they made the hardest game you've ever played. While editing the video, I realized that the main tell for Bayle's roar isn't head movement, but his right foot moving forward slightly, which is difficult to notice in the heat of battle. I would not have noticed this without reviewing my footage to make the video. This will be especially hard to see if the camera is stuck inside his body. Fromsoft has completely lost the plot. It's no longer about making a fun game for the majority of players that is also hard. It's about hiding the intended way to play behind obscurity so that you either need to die hundreds of times through trial and error learning the boss, or you have to research challenge runner footage to learn the boss. For those of us who want to overcome the boss without copying other strategies or doing tons of trial and error, this makes the learning process extremely unfun. Pair this with insane tracking to punish positioning openings, high damage, slow healing speed, and 1.5 million delayed attacks that you need to learn through trial and error, and the bosses are simply not fun to learn at all. I need at least faster healing speed and probably a Shadows Die Twice revival mechanic to make this start to feel fun. The reason why Fromsoft fans who disliked Elden Ring boss design looked back fondly on Sekiro was because it was a hard game that gave the player tools to help learn boss movesets more quickly. They showed the posture bar, jumping attacks, stab attacks, had fast healing speed, allowed you to cancel attacks, and gave you revives. Is Sekiro beatable without any of these tools? Yes. Would it be a lot harder? Of course. But would it be more fun? I think the answer is obvious. Let's say a boss like Rellana takes me a little under 4 hours to beat. The first 2 to 3 hours aren't actually beatable because I haven't learned enough of their moveset. By the final 30 minutes, the boss starts becoming fun in a challenge run, I have to dodge 1 billion attacks sort of way, but I had to suffer through hours of boring trial and error dying while healing to get there, which was not fun at all. This means that the majority of my time spent fighting the bosses on my first playthrough was not fun. Pair this up with the majority of exploration being boring, and the majority of legacy dungeons being underwhelming, and all of the 3 main elements I play Souls games for are not very good in the DLC. I feel like I'm seeing an almost cult-like response from some Fromsoft fans against the difficulty criticism. They'll say things like, "You're complaining that the games known for being hard are hard. Stop complaining, get good." I think this sentiment is so absurdly stupid on so many levels. Firstly, hard doesn't and has never equated to good game design. Mario the Lost Levels is much harder than the original Mario, yet the first Mario is definitely the better game for the majority of players. Fromsoft creates entertainment. These games are not sacred relics with challenges that are inherently good, because it's technically possible to do every boss hitless if you look up a guide, or spend an obscene amount of hours doing trial and error deaths fighting it. It's uncanny to me how cult-like this community can be. I think it's rooted in the fact that Fromsoft made a reputation for designing hard games that weren't actually hard. Dark Souls 1 isn't hard, it's just unique, and it punishes people who don't try to learn its unique mechanics. With Shadow of the Erdtree, this is completely not true at all. This game is absurdly difficult for the sake of being difficult. There's this Souls-like cycle where a new game comes out, people rage about the difficulty, and then a few years later people say it was never all that hard and you just had to adapt. I firmly believe that Elden Ring DLC has broken the cycle. This game will always be seen as hard. Sure, some challenge runners might be like, oh, I fought the boss for a ton of hours, now I can do every boss hitless, but it took a ton of hours to get there, or they were looking up other people's strategies on the internet. The way I see it, Fromsoft encountered a problem. How do we keep up our reputation of making hard games if we aren't introducing any new base mechanics that are difficult to master, since it's still just dodge hit? The answer is quadruple the damage, double the boss health bars, and hide the intended openings and ways to avoid attacks underneath several layers of trial and error and obscurity. If you dislike this design approach, that's fine, I don't like it either, and no game is above criticism because the developer has a good reputation. Personally, one of my biggest issues with the boss design isn't just that some bosses are hard, it's that all the bosses are over the top. Elden Ring's base game has dynamics in its difficulty that crescendoed towards the end, while the DLC is always hitting the highest note, and I don't find that fun. I find it tiring. Whenever I find a new boss, it doesn't feel rewarding, it feels like a punishment. Time to get hit a few times, try to heal, and die. I'm certain a counter-argument to my criticisms is that I should just use summons or an overpowered build if I dislike the boss mechanics. But me using split aggro or an overpowered build to ignore the mechanics doesn't make me like learning the boss mechanics. Skipping boss mechanics doesn't make me enjoy them, and I am tired of this brain-dead Fromsoft cult-like response to avoid all criticism, and to act like their game has no flaws because you can skip some parts of it if you don't like it. Part of the reason I find it so annoying to argue with Fromsoft fans is because they always start every conversation from the perspective that every complaint is your fault in some way, get good, Miyazaki games are inherently perfect. It's so brain-dead, like they aren't individuals who think for themselves, but cult members preaching their creed. Also, if I end up using in-game tools to skip learning bosses, I wouldn't derive any positive or negative emotions from the bosses, and the only reason to play the game would be exploration, and I find the exploration of this DLC to be extremely underwhelming and barren, so it would not improve my experience. Before moving on, I should specify that I don't hate all the bosses once mastered, except the ones with terrible cameras, but I really dislike learning all of the boss movesets, and they made my first playthrough very much not fun. I'm now going to analyze all the bosses individually that have moves I consider over the top. It's worth noting that this video represents my experience of fighting the bosses without looking up hitless challenge run videos, and it's very likely that I have not fully optimized all of the boss movesets and openings. First up is Dancing Lion. He starts out hard but fair, then in phase 2 he switches between 3 elemental forms. In his lightning form, lightning shocks appear all across the arena to stagger you out of your openings. This was the little sprinkle of bullshit the boss needed to have to go from fun to aggravating. His ice phase was also annoying, since with every attack, a bunch of ice damage would just appear around his body, but it wasn't too high and you could just jump it, so it was more manageable than the lightning form. Midra, Lord of Frenzied Flame, is actually an amazing boss that isn't too hard to figure out. I love her design and graceful attack rhythm, and her openings are easy to find. The only issue is that Midra is especially bad at killing people who try to heal with her million spell attacks and fire roll catches. The Mother of Fingers is a difficult boss that I find fun, but at some point in the fight, she just spawns 3 add-on hand enemies. It's so stupid. You know what would make Elden Ring great? If Godric had a few soldiers of Godric, or if we threw in a Knight of Messmer into Messmer's boss arena. This isn't a slow Dark Souls 2 boss, it's Elden Ring, and we don't need add-ons in the boss arena. Also in phase 2, the Mother of Fingers will sometimes spam spell attacks like Elden Beast, which is also annoying. Commander Gaius is further proof that horse combat sucks balls. I genuinely hate it. This is a boar boss who never lets you heal, but is faster and more aggressive than other bosses since you're designed to fight it on a horse. But the horse doesn't have any iframes, and if he dies, you have to click through a stupid menu prompt for him to revive. Eventually, I just gave up and used the horse to dodge Gaius's oversized charge hitbox, then fought the boss melee. Some people enjoy horse combat because they use the iframes in your mount and dismounting animation to avoid attacks, which I think is the stupidest mechanic I've ever seen in a Fromsoft game. Yeah, I'll dodge the boss, just let me get off of the horse while his sword goes through me. That's really stupid, and I'm not going to do it. Just give the horse iframes on the dodge. Messmer is a really cool boss. Sometimes his combos go on a bit too long before you get an opening, and while it's possible I haven't optimized the boss's jumping openings, his tracking is so insanely good that I couldn't find any positioning openings during his massive combos. I particularly enjoyed Messmer's Phase 2 snake transformation attacks, as it escalated the epicness of the fight, although his explosion into multi-snake bite attack seemed a bit like a very hard to learn attack that the developer hopes does at least some damage. On the bright side, his snake phase introduces a new opening, since every time his snake form dissipates you can land a jumping or fully charged heavy attack. Moving on to the bosses that have higher levels of it's insane that Rellana is only the second boss. Her damage is extremely overtuned. Fromsoft defenders will say that you just need to level your Erdtree blessings, and that Rellana is like the market of the DLC. While they are technically correct, this doesn't sit well with me, because with Margit you're a weak character having to upgrade multiple progression trees through exploration to become strong enough to fight him. While with Rellana you're a high-leveled character on the second DLC boss who is stuck because you need to collect a single item to improve your stats, and that just seems really lame to me. Either way, the boss is kind of stupid. Her combo extenders seem to go on forever, her tracking is insanely fast, making positioning openings hard to pull off, and she aggressively punishes healing with melee attacks and spells. She also roll catches incorrect dodge roll directions with her two swords, making it hard to back out and heal, and she has a 5-part spell combo with roll catches built in. When a boss has this many roll catches, it sometimes feels less like I'm fighting a boss and more like I'm fighting the developer. When Rellana is near death, she does a triple moon staggered chain one-shot combo that hits the entire arena. After I first saw this attack, I literally said, "That's a streamer bait attack." It's made to get reactions and add an extra hour of length to the fight in case you had a good run on your hands with a one-shot that you didn't know how to dodge. There's probably some way to optimize Rellana's fight with jumping or positioning openings, but I didn't enjoy the boss with her ginormous long combo extenders and roll catches, so I did a fair bit of hit trading to break her posture and win quicker. There's only 2 bosses left to cover, and I saved the hardest bosses for last. Next up is Bayle the Dread. It's almost like Miyazaki heard challenge runners like me saying that Dark Eater Midir wasn't all that hard, and he said, "Alright, I'll show you a hard dragon fight." This boss is almost mechanically identical to Midir, but way harder. It's a dragon fight with a focus on hitting the head. Similar to Midir, Bayle breathes fire at his feet to punish people attacking his body. He also shoots fire straight out, but to add an extra pinch of bullshit, the fire hitbox will stray a little in the middle to hit you. Where the real issues with Bayle start are in his melee combos. On his second melee attack, he makes the dodge roll timing harder by using both arms, and it's easier to dodge if you roll forward right underneath him, which means that you have to dodge his follow-up attacks underneath him with the camera stuck in his body so that it's harder to see. Bayle also charges at the player constantly, which gets the camera stuck in his body as well. Bayle vs Midir is a perfect example of Fromsoft pursuing difficulty for difficulty's sake. Midir's hitboxes were smaller, so you could always roll backwards from his melee attacks and keep the camera locked onto his front side. But with Bayle, the camera is always stuck in his body, making the fight simply not fun. Then Bayle steps it up in Phase 2, where he just never stops attacking. This is especially frustrating because his damage is turned up to 11, and his health bar is ginormous for an Elden Ring boss. I discovered that his lightning wing stabs give you a rolling light attack opening in Phase 2 if you roll right, which helped me with the lack of openings. I somewhat enjoyed how over the top the boss was in his Phase 2 with giant explosions after his attacks, but I'll also say that it was a bit too visually cluttered for such a difficult boss. The only boss left to cover is the final boss of the DLC, Promised Consort Radahn. I know some of you are probably expecting me to outright hate this overly difficult boss, and I definitely hate parts of it, but I'm also a bit conflicted. In a DLC that's main theme is about being difficult for difficulty's sake, frankly, I'd probably be disappointed if the final boss wasn't the hardest boss of any Fromsoft game. Also, I said earlier that one of my biggest issues with the boss design was the lack of dynamics in the difficulty. I'm somewhat okay with Radahn or Malenia being over the top to make a narrative and gameplay point. Although I'm not opposed to the ending boss having extreme difficulty, I do think that some of the ways he achieves this difficulty is incredibly cheap. First of all, he has a 3-hit slash combo that I consider to be undodgeable on a medium roll. Now, this isn't actually true. Across my 11 hours of fighting Radahn, I dodged the attack multiple times, but the timing was so precise that I could not dodge it consistently. You have to dodge his initial swing and the roll catch in a single roll to avoid it. I couldn't find a dodge roll direction trick to make it much easier. Either way, it's obvious to me that From wanted this attack to be so difficult to dodge that it would appear undodgeable to many players, so they would die more often. However, this isn't the worst way Radahn achieves his difficulty. In Phase 2, Miquella jumps on Radahn's back and starts spamming spells everywhere, meaning that you have to play close to Radahn to get openings in without getting hit by the magic. This is all fine and good, but sometimes when Radahn turns his back to me mid-combo, I literally can't see his model through Miquella's hair, and then I die. This is made worse by the fact that Radahn is essentially delayed attack combos the boss. Every attack is delayed, and many of his combos look similar but have different timings to trick you into getting hit. That in and of itself is an annoying way to achieve difficulty, but paired with me not being able to see which delay he's doing, it's just bull. If you do end up getting hit at mid-range by the magic, the particle effects obscure Radahn to make it harder to see when to dodge. I really don't like visual clutter as a new form of difficulty. Also, Miquella has a 2-shot grab attack with an oversized hitbox that kills you at any health if you get hit twice. A difficult Fromsoft boss would not be complete without a terrible grab hitbox. Phase 2 Radahn's dodge roll timings are incredibly difficult to learn because he will do multiple clone attacks in a row that makes it hard to see where the damage is coming from. He can also do a meteor attack into a clone combo into a high damage death explosion attack. I could not figure out how to dodge this, so I started using Bloodhound Step, and I would usually still get hit a bit. After a few days, I saw a challenge runner dodge it by jumping away backwards right from the meteor, and then continuously running back right to avoid all the clone attacks without dodging, but I did not figure this out during my run. If Radahn's seemingly infinite range purple gravity suction attack lands in Phase 2, he does the most over-the-top death combo to punish you. I don't even think you can avoid all of the damage after getting hit by the initial attack. Because of my deaths to the hard-to-dodge roll-catch combo and hard-to-understand clone attacks, and worst of all, to Miquella's hair, I was more angered by this boss than any other Fromsoft boss, to the point that I almost said, "This is stupid, I don't enjoy the game anymore, I'm gonna summon, get a Great Shield, and skip this bullshit boss." However, before I fully gave up, I decided to switch to a bleed build, and after 11 hours of total fighting, I managed to carve out a victory, which means that this boss took me longer to beat than any other Fromsoft boss at a normal level, and is the only boss that ever got me to build switch. After I won, sure, I felt a sense of happiness and relief, but was it fun entertainment? No, not really. I was happy at the end because the suffering was over, not because I enjoyed the experience. Do you guys remember when Fromsoft used to make fun games that challenged you in a unique way? I never thought difficulty was From's #1 priority. I thought difficulty was one tool they used to enhance the art. But now difficulty seems like the entire point of their games, and I don't think I'm enjoying it anymore. This DLC felt more like a job than entertainment to me. I guess From achieved one important thing with Radahn, which was to make a boss so hard that it'd probably take me hours to learn even with Mimic Tier. Summoning truly has become the intended normal mode. On a side note, I wasn't a huge fan of the story. Fromsoft games have good lore, but the in-game stories are becoming stale and predictable. There are gods. Kill them. Every time. I thought maybe something would happen with helping Mikola ascend or something, but no. You never find him until the end, and then you kill him. I remember back when Matthew Matosis criticized Dark Souls 2 for wanting to kill the player more than it wanted to be a good game, pointing out things like the Firekeepers laughing about how much you'll die in the beginning, and the hub world having a death count. Matthew Matosis quoted Miyazaki as saying, "Difficulty was never the point. The games weren't designed to be challenging just for the sake of it. It was a way to pull you into the world." I think Miyazaki has lost sight of his original vision. Difficulty definitely seems like the point of the DLC. In this way, Shadow of the Erdtree feels more like Dark Souls 2 than any other Souls game, although it achieves the difficulty in very different ways. Many of the bosses did not feel like immersive fights to me. It felt more like the developer trying to trick me into dying as much as possible to the high damage roll catches and delayed attacks, and my inability to safely heal. Shadow of the Erdtree is the only Miyazaki-led Souls title that I wish never existed. If instead the time was spent developing Elden Ring 2, they could reset the difficulty and progression trees, giving me a reason to explore a new open world. This DLC reminds me a lot of Tears of the Kingdom. It's not as content-barren as that game, but both games allowed me to take off my rose-colored glasses and see the open world genre for all its flaws. I once saw Elden Ring as an unrivaled masterpiece when it came to exploration, and while I still think base game Elden Ring is the best open world I've ever played, it also does fall prey to all of the shortcomings of open world game design. The good content is spread thin across vast expanses of empty space and underwhelming side dungeons. Breath of the Wild proved that people will enjoy doing boring if it feels like their discovery and they get a reward, and Elden Ring DLC took out the reward part of the formula, and it does not work at all. Now I think I'm getting over this open world craze. That's not to say I wouldn't enjoy an Elden Ring 2, but I think I'd enjoy a linear, more condensed experience over this. If the next Zelda or Fromsoft game is open world, I hope it's a smaller open world with quality as the main focus instead of quantity, and in Fromsoft's case, fun as the focus instead of difficulty. I've been pretty negative throughout this video, so let me state that there are definitely some groups of people who will enjoy this game, and that the hype isn't just because of the honeymoon phase. People who are satisfied with pretty visuals as the main reward for exploration, people who like beating bosses with overpowered builds, and people who like to perfect boss mechanics through many hours of trial and error will all enjoy Elden Ring DLC. Also, the music was quite amazing, it was better than the base game, and some of From's best. However, all of these positives were not enough for me to feel the Fromsoft magic. I remember when Joseph Anderson said at the end of his Elden Ring critique that Elden Ring made him lose interest in From's future Souls-like titles that are played in the style of Dark Souls. At first I thought Joe was taking it a bit too far, but now I'm in the same boat as him. I do not have any interest in another dodge-hit Fromsoft game that is hard for the sake of being hard without introducing new mechanics. And I might start to skip learning boss mechanics with summons and OP builds if this keeps up, and only play the games for exploration. If they make a game that is hard because it introduces new mechanics like in Sekiro, I'll be interested in learning it, but I've had enough of this game design approach. I would not recommend this DLC to any of my friends as entertainment, but I could recommend it as a dare. I dare you to try to put up with these overly aggressive, overtuned, hard-to-learn bosses. I dare you to try to do it without summons. The game is more fun to watch someone suffer through on Twitch than it is to be played.